Every old house keeps a secret in its foundations. This one kept a name, and the boy sworn to protect it never imagined it would one day look back at him. And so, our story begins. The ministry's sealed archives smelled of scorched vellum and the cold mineral dust of stone that had never once been warmed by sun. Hermione had been coming down here for 11 days, and on each of them the same thing happened at the same depth of the stair. The sound of her own footsteps stopped being hers. The vault swallowed the echo and gave back nothing, and she walked the last 20 steps in a silence so complete she could hear the small wet click of her own throat when she swallowed. She had asked for this posting. She reminded herself of that most mornings. The war had left the ministry with cellars full of things nobody wanted to name. Confiscations, estate seizures, 9 centuries of paper that had belonged to families who were now dead or imprisoned or sitting very still in their drawing rooms hoping to be forgotten. Somebody had to sort it. Hermione had put her hand up because the alternative was another year of being photographed, and because paper did not ask her how she was coping. The ledger came up from crate 41 on a Tuesday. It was enormous, the size of a hearthstone, bound in something too thick and too pale to be calf, and burned. Not burned through, burned across, the way a document burns when someone holds it into a flame and then loses their nerve. The fire had eaten a black crescent out of the center pages and stopped. The char had the texture of mothwing. When she lifted the cover, the spine made a sound like a small animal's joint. There was no title, only, pressed into the leather in blind embossing that caught the lamplight at one angle and vanished at every other, a single word: Concordantia. She knew what it was before her mind consented to know it. Every historian of magical Britain knew the name, and none of them had seen the object. The concordance, the roll of the assembly, the body that had held the hereditary bench of the Wizengamot since 1391, that adjudicated marriage contracts between the old houses, that kept the Gringotts vaults nobody could enumerate. A club, the newspapers called it, when they dared call it anything. Hermione had written 400 words about it once, in a footnote, and had been unable to source a single one of them. She turned the pages with the flat of her hand because her fingertips had begun to sweat. Names, columns of them, in inks that changed century by century. Oak gall gone rust brown, then the flat black of the 18th century, then a blue-black that ran when a drop of something had fallen on it in 1802. Malfoy, Black, Selwyn, Rosier, Greengrass, Burke. Names she had heard shouted across a battlefield. Names she had read on gravestones. Names she had watched walk free. And then the char. She reached the burned crescent, and her hand went over it without her deciding anything, the way one puts a palm to a bruise. The parchment was warm. That was the first wrong thing. It had been in a stone crate below the water table for a decade, and it was warm, and the warmth had the specific quality of skin. Not fire, not friction, but the low animal heat of something that had been alive very recently and might be again. The second wrong thing happened under her fingers. The char moved. Not flaked, not crumbled. Moved, drawing back the way frost retreats from a window when a hand is laid against the glass. Beneath it, the parchment was not black at all, but the soft dun of old cream, unmarked, waiting. And into that, Waiting, the ink came up. It did not appear. It rose, the way water rises in a well when the rope goes slack, welling out of the fibre itself in a script 200 years older than her own century. Brown-red, deliberate, unhurried. Granger, then a date, then a line, ruled by no hand she could see, then another name, and another, a whole branch unspooling downward through generations while the lamp guttered and the dust hung motionless in the air, and Hermione stood with her palm flat on a book that was rewriting itself and did not breathe. The last name it wrote took 11 seconds. Hermione Jean Granger. The final letter finished with a small flourish, and the flourish was still wet, and she watched a bead of that impossible ink slide 0.5 millimeter and stop, and something in her chest performed a movement she had no word for. Not fear exactly, though her hands had gone cold to the second knuckle. It was the sensation of a flaw she had trusted her whole life, quietly announcing that it had never been a flaw. She did not tell anyone that day, or the next. On the third day the letter came, and it did not come by owl. It was on her desk when she arrived, and her office had been warded by her own hand with 3 enchantments she had refined herself. Black paper, silver ink, no stamp, no seal, no sender. 4 lines in a copper plate so exact it looked printed. The assembly of the concordance has been apprised. Attendance is required, not requested. The house will find you at the hour of 8. Come alone, or the door will not open at all. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she straightened the cuff of her left sleeve, which was already straight, and then she straightened it again, and then she noticed that she was doing it, and put her hands flat on the desk until they stopped. The house found her at 8. She had walked out into a wet November evening off Diagon, and turned a corner she had turned 1,000 times, and the corner was longer than it had been. Rain came down in a fine cold sift that got inside the collar. The street lamps thinned, and then the pavement under her boots stopped being pavement and became gravel, and there was a wall, and in the wall a gate of black iron worked into a pattern of interlocking rings, and beyond it a house. It was not large. That surprised her most. She had expected a palace and got instead a squat Jacobean manor, 3 stories, dark brick, every window lit and every window shuttered, so that the light came out only in thin gold seams around the edges of the frames. The rain fell through those seams and turned to gold falling, briefly, and then was ordinary rain again on the other side. The gate opened before she touched it. Inside, the air was warm and completely still, and smelled of beeswax and cold ash, and, underneath, faintly of blood. The iron ghost of it, the way a room smells hours after someone has bled in it, and it has been cleaned very well. A house elf so old its skin had gone the grey of pewter took her cloak without meeting her eyes, and walked away with it as though carrying something diseased. The chamber they put her in had no chairs. That was deliberate. She understood it at once. 23 people stood in a rough crescent, and every one of them was dressed in the fashion of 100 years ago, and not one of them looked directly at her. They looked at her hem, her hairline, the air over her left shoulder. It was a technique. It had been taught to them, and they had taught it to each other, and its purpose was to make the person in the center of the room understand that she was an event and not a guest. A woman came forward, small, upright, 70, with a face like a well-kept blade, and a rope of pearls that had gone the colour of teeth. Ambrosia Selwyn. She did not offer her hand. You have touched the concordance. It touched me, rather. Yes. Something happened at the corner of Selwyn's mouth that was not a smile. That is precisely the difficulty. She explained it in the flattest voice Hermione had ever heard, and the flatness was itself a kind of violence, because the woman would not give her the dignity of anger. The Granger line. Anglo-Norman seated at Wexcombe admitted to the concordance in 1417, senior branch, and in the spring of 1698 struck out of every register in magical Britain, not extinct, not lapsed, struck deliberately with fire and with law, and afterwards the descendants had gone quietly out into the other world and forgotten what they were, and had married and had children, and had become, in the fullness of 4 centuries, dentists in Hampstead. The concordance cannot be forged and cannot be persuaded, Selwyn said. It records what is. It has recorded you. And by the statute of 1391, which no member and no minister and no Wizengamot has power to amend, the eldest surviving heir of the senior line does not merely hold a seat among us. The stillness in the room acquired weight. She holds the convener's chair, said Selwyn. Somebody, behind and to the left, made a small sound through the nose. Hermione heard herself say, very evenly, "No, I beg your pardon. No, I decline. Whatever this is, a club, a cabal, a very old habit. I want no part of it, and I'd have thought that would come as a relief to everyone in this room." Her pulse was going hard in the side of her neck, and she kept her voice low so it wouldn't shake. "Strike me out. You've done it before. You seem to have a talent for it." And Ambrosia Selwyn smiled, properly for the first time, and Hermione understood with a slow drop in the stomach that she had said exactly what the woman had come here to hear. "You may decline," Selwyn said gently. "Of course. And on your declining, the chair passes to the next line by seniority." A pause, weighted like a coin laid on a table. "Which is mine?" The room did not move. The chair holds the hereditary bench, 11 votes in the Wizengamot that no election has ever touched. It holds the marriage compacts. I could name you 9 girls of 15 presently contracted, and you would find their contracts lawful, and you would find you could do nothing. It holds vaults your ministry has spent a decade pretending it cannot see. Selwyn's voice never rose. "You may hand me all of it this evening, Miss Granger, and go home and sleep quite soundly. I imagine you would sleep very soundly indeed." Hermione's hands had gone still at her sides. Somewhere under her ribs, a door she had been holding shut all evening swung slowly open onto a long, dark corridor, and she saw exactly where it went. "That's a trap," she said. "That is inheritance," said Selwyn. "You will find they are not easily distinguished." The old woman turned then and addressed the crescent, and now her voice did carry, dry and formal, and the 23 straightened as one animal. The claimant does not withdraw. Then the assembly invokes the reckoning. A year and a day, 3 ordeals, and confirmation only upon all 3. And as the statute provides that no claimant shall be tried in ignorance of the law, the pearls turned, and the pale eyes came at last directly, deliberately onto Hermione's face. The rememberer is bound to instruct her. Summon him. Something began behind Hermione's sternum, a low humming pressure like the air before a hex. She had read enough. She knew the office. 9 generations, 1 family. The double doors at the end of the chamber opened, and the seam of light widened across the floorboards and reached her boots. And a man walked out of it with rain still bright on the shoulders of his coat, and his jaw set like a man walking towards a sentence he had already read. Draco Malfoy looked at her, and for one unguarded fraction of a second, before the cold came down over his face like a shutter, he looked as though somebody had struck him under the heart. The binding took 4 minutes and left a mark on neither of them. That was the part Hermione could not stop turning over afterwards. That a thing so total could be transacted so cheaply. Selwyn read the formula from a card she did not need. Draco held out his left hand, palm down, and Hermione was made to lay hers over it without touching, a hair's breadth of air between them. And for the whole of those 4 minutes, she was aware of nothing in the world except the warmth coming up off his skin and the fact that he did not once move his fingers. Ad instruendam, non ad favendam, Selwyn said. To instruct, not to favour. You will teach her every law, every custom, every precedent and every courtesy that a claimant is entitled to know. You will withhold nothing that is hers by right. You will offer nothing that is not. I know the terms, Draco said. Your father knew them also. Hermione saw it, not on his face, which had been arranged into a smooth and courteous nothing since he had walked through the doors, but at the base of his throat, where the pulse jumped once, hard and settled. Then it was finished, and the elf brought her cloak, and she was walking back down a gravel drive that became a wet pavement halfway along, into an ordinary November, where a man was arguing with a taxi driver, and neither of them knew that a house existed 60 feet behind them. The letter with the address came at dawn. Not black paper this time, cream. And the handwriting was a fast, spare, forward-leaning hand that gave the impression of someone who wrote a great deal and disliked doing it. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 7 in the evening. The library, not the house. Wear something with sleeves. She read the last 4 words 9 times, hunting the insult in them, and could not find it, and hated that more than if she had. The Malfoy library was a separate building. She had not known that. It stood a 1/4 of a mile from the manor across a park where the grass had gone the colour of wet rope. A long, low hall of grey stone with a slate roof and no ornament of any kind. And when she came up the path in the dark, the only light in it was 1 window. And in that window, the shape of a man standing with his back to her. Inside, the smell hit her before the warmth did. The tooth of old parchment, that faint acid rasp at the back of the nose, beeswax, a cold fireplace's last night of smoke, and something green and bitter that turned out to be a bowl of hellebore left to dry on a windowsill by somebody who had died before Hermione was born. 9,000 volumes. She did the arithmetic without wanting to, running her eye along the shelves, and her chest did something painful and undignified. "Don't," he said, from the far end. "I haven't done anything." You were about to touch a spine. Half of them are keyed to the family and would take the skin off your palm, and I would then have to explain to the assembly why the claimant arrived at her first ordeal with a bandaged hand. He came down the length of the hall. He had taken his coat off. grey shirt, sleeves turned back twice, a thin silver ring on the smallest finger of his right hand that she had never noticed before, and now found she could not stop noticing. Sit. Where? Anywhere. It doesn't matter. A pause. That's the first lesson. It always matters, and you must give the appearance of a person who has never once considered it. Sit. She sat. He set a book in front of her, and then another, and then a third, and the third was so heavy the table took it with a low wooden groan. "You have 11 months," he said. "In that time, you will learn 9 centuries of a language that has no dictionary because it was never written down for anyone who might need to look it up. You will learn it well enough that 23 people who want you destroyed cannot find a seam. I am not going to be kind about it." "I didn't expect you to be." "No," he said. "You expected me to be cruel. That's different, and it's going to make this take longer than it needs to." She looked up sharply. He had already turned away. He began with the hand, not with law, not with history, which she could have swallowed whole and had been half looking forward to, with the hand. Right hand for the seal, never the left. The left hand carries the ring, and the ring is a statement of house. If you offer it, you are offering your house. And there are 4 men in that room who would take you up on it and make you spend a year explaining that you did not mean it. He set a wax jack in front of her and a signet blank and a taper. "Show me." She took the seal in her right hand, thumb along the shank, not across it. She adjusted. "Now press. Slowly. The wax must take the whole face at once, not one edge and then the other. If it comes out crescent-shaped, they will say the convener cannot even close a letter." She pressed. It came out crescent-shaped. Again. 9 times. The 10th was clean, and he did not remark on it, simply took the sheet away and gave her another. Then the inclination of the head. 1/2 an inch for a member of the assembly, 1 inch for a widow of the 1st degree. Nothing at all. Nothing, Granger, not a fraction. For anyone whose house sits below yours in the concordance, which is now every house in Britain without exception. If you dip your head to Ambrosia Selwyn, you will have conceded the chair in front of witnesses, and there is no procedure to take it back. That's grotesque. Yes. It's a set of manners designed so that a person who doesn't already know them cannot possibly survive one evening. "Yes," he said. "That is what they are for. 1/2 an inch. Do it." She did it. He watched with an attention so exact it was almost impersonal, the way a jeweller watches a stone go under the loop, and she felt the back of her neck go hot and told herself it was the fire. Too slow. You look as though you're deciding. Again, again, and again. And when she got it, he said nothing at all and turned the page. By the 4th week, she had begun to hate the sound of her own voice in that hall. He corrected her 40, 50 times an evening, never loudly, never with any relish that she could catch, though she looked for it, hunted it, wanted it. Because if he had sneered once, she could have hated him cleanly and gone home lighter. He did not sneer. He said no, and again, and once, memorably, that is the correct answer for 1642, and you are not in 1642, and each correction landed with a small, precise sting of a needle, and none of them drew blood. And by 10 o'clock, she was so tired she could not remember which hand held the seal. She learned the forms of address for a widow of the 2nd degree, which differed from the first degree by one syllable, and the difference in that syllable had once caused a duel. She learned that the assembly's oldest members would offer her wine, and that to refuse was an accusation, and to accept without turning the glass a quarter turn was to say she trusted them, and that she must never say she trusted them. She learned 12 ways to end a conversation, and only one of them was polite. And she learned, without ever once being told, that Draco Malfoy did not sit down. He paced the length of the hall while he spoke, or stood at the window with his back to her, or leaned against the shelf ladder with his arms folded. But in 7 weeks, he never took the chair opposite hers, though it was there, though it had a cushion worn to the shape of somebody's decades. And the first time she noticed the pattern, she found herself watching for it. And every time it repeated something in her, tightened a quarter turn, like a glass being made safe. It broke on a Thursday in the middle of December. She had got the same passage wrong 3 times. It was a question of precedence. A dowager of a cadet branch entering a room where the senior line was already seated, and the rule was arbitrary and ancient and stupid. And on the 3rd failure, she pushed the book away hard enough that the wax jack rattled. "This is a game," she said. "You know that. It's a game with a rule book 900 pages long that the players wrote for themselves, and you are teaching me to play it beautifully, and at the end of it, I will be very good at something that should never have existed." He was at the window. He did not turn. "Yes," he said. "Then why?" "Because they will use it to kill you." Now he turned. The lamplight came at him from the side and cut his face into planes. "Not with a wand. There isn't a person in that assembly who would risk it. They will use the 6th clause of the ordeal statute, which permits any confirmed member to call a point of form against a claimant, and if the point is upheld 3 times, the claim voids. 3, not 30. 3 small, stupid, arbitrary things. The wrong hand, the wrong syllable, a head bowed half an inch too far. And Ambrosia Selwyn has the chair and the bench, and the 9 contracts, and you will have made a speech about how the whole thing should never have existed, and it will exist anyway, and it will exist worse. The fire settled. The sound was very loud. "You want to break it," he said. "Fine. I don't care what you do with it. But you cannot break a thing you are standing outside of, and the only door in is the one they built, and I am the only person alive who knows where they hid the latch." His jaw worked once. "So, we will do the dowager again." She looked at him for a long moment. "You could have let me fail," she said quietly. "The binding says you must teach. It doesn't say you must teach well." Something crossed his face and was gone before she could name it. He came away from the window, and for the length of 2 steps, she thought he was going to take the chair opposite hers. She was aware of it as a physical anticipation, a small, held-breath tension in her wrists. And then he stopped a yard short and picked up the book instead. "The dowager," he said, "enters last and is seated first. Again." They finished at 11. She was gathering her notes with hands that had gone clumsy from cold and hours, and he said, without looking up from the shelf where he was replacing a volume, "Selwyn will be at the Averys on the 19th. She'll approach you before the soup. She will use your Christian name." Hermione's head came up. And what do I do? Nothing. That is the entire answer. She does it so that you will either permit it, which makes you her inferior, or correct her, which makes you shrill. He slid the book home. So, you do the third thing. You look at her exactly as long as it takes to be certain she knows you heard it, and then you speak to the person on her left about something else. Hermione set down her notes. She turned to face the room, and she found the space in the air where Ambrosia Selwyn's face would be, and she let her eyes rest there. 1 second, 2, with no expression whatsoever. And then she turned her head an unhurried quarter and said to an empty chair, "Lady Avery, the frost has been very hard on the roses this year." The silence in the hall changed quality. She looked back. Draco was standing with his hand still flat against the spine of the book he had shelved, absolutely motionless, and on his face, for the space of a single breath before the shutter came down and his features went smooth and cold and courteous again, was something raw and astonished and almost like grief. He took his hand off the shelf. "That will do," he said, "for tonight." The Avery house at Thornbury had been built to be entered slowly. Hermione understood the architecture as a weapon within 10 seconds of crossing the threshold. The hall ran 40 feet before it gave you anywhere to stand, and the floor was black and white marble, laid in a lozenge pattern that made you watch your own feet. And at the far end of it, 11 people were waiting with drinks in their hands, and all the time in the world. Whoever walked that 40 feet did it alone, and did it observed. And by the time she arrived at the other end, her whole body would have told them everything they wanted to know. "Don't look at the floor." She had heard it in his voice before she thought it. That had been happening for 3 weeks now, small instructions surfacing in her head in a dry, unhurried baritone at odd hours over her own breakfast. She found it intolerable, and she used it anyway. She did not look at the floor. She walked the 40 feet at the pace of a woman crossing her own drawing room, and she arrived, and she let the silence sit for the half second it wanted before she filled it. "Mrs. Avery, thank you for the invitation." "Miss Granger." Cassandra Avery had a face like a wax fruit, beautifully made and slightly too smooth. Her eyes went in one economical sweep to the hem of Hermione's gown, the set of her shoulders, the ring finger of her left hand, and back. "How brave of you to come." 1/2 an inch was the inclination for a member of the assembly. Hermione gave her exactly that, and not a hair over, and watched the wax fruit register it, and watched something behind the wax go still. Selwyn came at her before the soup, precisely as promised. "Hermione, my dear, you look tired." The name landed in the middle of the group like a coin dropped on glass. 4 conversations paused and did not admit to pausing. Hermione turned her head, and she let her gaze rest on Ambrosia Selwyn's face for the length of 2 heartbeats. No expression, no heat, nothing to take hold of. And then she turned an unhurried quarter to the man on Selwyn's left. "Mr. Burke, I understand you've had the Wexcombe field walk surveyed. I should be glad to know what came up." Burke, who had not expected to be spoken to, and certainly not about that, made a noise like a startled goose and began to explain about the ditch system. And by the time he had got to the second ditch, The moment was 6 feet behind them and irretrievable. Selwyn's smile did not move, but her pearls turned once against her collarbone, and Hermione, who had spent 7 weeks being taught to read exactly that class of gesture, felt something small and hot and shameful open in her chest. "I am enjoying this," she thought. "God help me." He was on the other side of the room. She had known where he was since the moment she entered, and she resented the knowing. Draco stood by the second window with a glass he had not drunk from, listening to a woman in green with an expression of perfect attentive courtesy. And he had not looked at Hermione once. Not when she came down the 40 feet. Not when Selwyn used her name. The consistency of it had begun to feel less like indifference and more like a man holding a door shut from the other side. They went in to supper at 8. The table was laid for 19 and lit by candles set so low that everyone's face was underlit and slightly wrong. She was seated at the foot, which was either an insult or a courtesy, depending on a clause she could not remember, and she made a note to ask, and hated that too. The wine came. She turned her glass a quarter turn before she drank from it and saw 2 heads move. For an hour it was almost bearable. Then Corbin Rosier put down his fork. He was perhaps 60, with a heavy, pale face and the wet, pleased eyes of a man who has waited a long time for a specific opportunity and has decided the moment has arrived. He did not address her. That was the technique. One addressed the table and left the subject sitting in the middle of it like a dropped dish. "What troubles me," said Rosier comfortably, "is not the ledger. The ledger is the ledger. What troubles me is the 400 years between." Somebody murmured. 4 centuries out in the mud, he went on, marrying whoever came to hand. One doesn't like to be indelicate, but blood is a practice, is it not? As much as a fact. It's a thing one keeps. You may find a peregrine's egg in a hen run, and it may still be a peregrine, but you'd be a fool to expect it to know how to stoop. He looked, at last, down the table, and his eyes were shining. One wonders what precisely has been passed down, beyond the dentistry. The silence that followed had a texture. Hermione felt it settle over her scalp and down her arms. She had a reply. She had 4. Every one of them was hot, and every one of them was correct, and every one of them would end with her being described for the next 30 years as the claimant who had lost her temper at the Averys' table. She set her hand flat on the cloth to keep it still. And then, from halfway up the table, in a voice so level and so unhurried that half the room did not at first understand that anyone had spoken. "You've made a point of form, Rosier." Rosier's head came round. "I beg your pardon?" "You've made a point of form." Draco had not raised his eyes from his plate. He turned his knife a fraction, aligning it with nothing. Against a claimant at a private table in the hearing of 6 confirmed members of the Assembly. Under the 6th clause, that is a formal action whether you intended it or not, and it will have to be entered in the roll, and it will have to be adjudicated. Now he looked up. "Shall I tell you how it will be adjudicated, or would you prefer to withdraw it and eat your fish?" The wax-fruit face at the head of the table had gone a shade paler. "I made no formal Aikenhead's case, 1604. Draco's voice did not rise. It simply took up more room. A member observed at a supper that the claimant's grandmother had been a Fleming. He intended it as conversation. The assembly held that any statement touching the fitness of a claimant's descent, made before 3 or more members, constitutes a point of form and is actionable, and that the member is thereafter bound by it. Bound, Rosier. You may not withdraw a point of form once 3 members have heard it. That's Ombersley, 1711, and there are 200 years of practice on it that nobody has troubled to overturn because nobody has been stupid enough at dinner. A pause of exactly the right length. You've spent one of your 3. You have 2 remaining for the whole of the year and the day on the Peregrine. Nobody breathed. And when it is adjudicated, Draco went on, the rememberer will be required to state the precedent. The precedent is Granger versus the Assembly, 1698, the last occasion on which a point of form was raised on the ground of a claimant's descent from the senior line. The finding in that case was that descent recorded in the concordance is not open to question by any member, since the book is the instrument of proof and the member is not. It was found unanimously. His eyes had not left Rosier's face. It was found against your house. The candle nearest Hermione guttered and stood up again. Your ancestor paid the fine, said Draco, in the old measure, which was land. Wexcombe Field, as it happens. The ditch system Mr. Burke has been surveying. He picked up his glass at last. So when the roll is read, it will be read that a Rosier has now twice attempted to unseat a Granger on the ground of blood, and twice been informed by the Assembly's own record that the ground does not exist. I should think that will be remembered longer than the fish. He drank. Sit down, Corbin, said Ambrosia Selwyn from the head of the table in a voice like a closing drawer. Rosier sat down. He had not been standing. Hermione got through the rest of it. She could not afterwards have said what she ate or what she said, only that her replies came out at the right length and the right temperature, and that a woman on her left told her about a spaniel. Draco did not look at her again. Not once. Through the pudding, through the standing about afterwards, through the slow choreography of coats and farewells. He spoke to the woman in green. He spoke to Avery about drainage. He put his glass down on a side table without a sound and turned his shoulder to the room in a way that was not rudeness and was absolutely a wall. She found him in the east corridor because she went looking, and she did not let herself examine why. It was a long, dim passage of panelled oak, lit at intervals by sconces that had been charmed to burn low, and the sound of the party came down. It thinned and warped, like music heard through water. Their footsteps had that hollow doubling that old houses give. He was pulling on his coat at the far end, near the garden door, where a draught came in, cold and smelling of wet box hedge and iron frost. Malfoy. He went still with one arm in the sleeve. Then he finished the movement. You shouldn't be down here. They'll notice. They noticed an hour ago. She came closer and stopped 6 feet short because the corridor had suddenly acquired a specific and unhelpful atmospheric pressure. Why did you do that? It was a point of form. It's my office to state precedent. There's nothing else in it. You spent a Malfoy's credit in that room to say it. I stated the law. You chose which law. Her voice came out lower than she meant. You could have let it pass as conversation. Nobody in that room would have called it. You made it formal so it would cost him, and then you made it cost him publicly, and there is no clause in the binding that required a single word of it. He looked at the garden door. Granger. Don't do that. Do what? Say my name and then nothing. You've done it 3 times. Something reckless was rising in her, and she let it come. You've been standing at windows with your back to me for 2 months, and I have not once asked you why, and I'm not asking now, but I would like, very much, to be told what happened at that table. The sconce nearest them made a small sound. He turned round. In the low light, his face had lost the smoothness it wore in company. There was something worn under his eyes, and the line of his mouth was not arranged. He compared you to a bird in a hen run, Draco said, at his own table, in front of his own wife, and everyone there thought it was rather good. That was all. He did not elaborate. He looked away. Hermione discovered that her hands were shaking. It came on her all at once, the way it sometimes did now, hours after. The delayed animal reckoning that arrived when the danger was over, and there was nothing left to spend it on. She had one glove on. The other was in her fist. She tried to work her fingers into it, and the leather would not take them, and she tried again, and her thumb caught the seam, and she made a small, furious sound in her throat. Give it here. I can. Granger! He was already there. Give it here. He took the glove. He took her hand. The first contact of his fingers was a shock out of all proportion. Bare skin, cool, and the thin bite of the silver ring against her knuckle. And neither of them said anything at all. He drew the leather over her fingers one at a time, unhurried, working the seams straight with his thumb the way a man does who has been dressed by servants his whole life and has watched it done 10,000 times. His head was bent. She could see the place where his hair fell forward and the small, pale scar under his jaw that she had never been close enough to see before. And she could hear the wet box hedge dripping outside the garden door. And she could hear her own pulse. And she did not breathe. He reached the wrist. There were 4 buttons. He did them one by one. The corridor made its hollow doubling sound around nothing, because neither of them had moved a foot in over a minute. On the last button, his thumb rested for a moment against the inside of her wrist, over the pulse, and stopped there. A half second, no more, long enough for him to have felt exactly what it was doing. He let go. He stepped back and put his hands in his coat pockets. Tuesday, he said. 7. Don't be late. Then he opened the garden door and went out into the frost, and Hermione stood alone in the corridor with her gloved hand held against her chest, entirely unable to account for the fact that she could still feel the cold of that ring long after the door had shut. The first ordeal was announced by letter on the 2nd of January, and the letter was 4 lines long, and Hermione read it standing in her kitchen with her tea going cold at her elbow. The assembly will keep the midwinter at Ravensmere on the last night of the month. The convener's measure will open the evening. The claimant will dance it with the rememberer as the statute provides. Failure to open the floor is failure of the ordeal. She read it a 5th time. Then she set it face down on the table, which did not help because she could still see it through the paper. It isn't a dance, Draco said. It has music. It has steps. There are 2 people. Forgive me if I've missed a subtlety. It's a proof. He had pushed the long table back against the shelves and rolled the rug, and the flagstones of the library floor lay bare and grey and enormous between them. Two houses stand up together in front of the assembly and demonstrate that neither of them intends the other harm. That's all it ever was. In 1402 they did it with the wands out. The music came later to make it bearable. And what does it prove now? Now, he said, it proves whether you can be touched by a Malfoy for 11 minutes without your face telling everyone in the room what you think of it. The fire had burned down to a low copper glow, and the hall was cold at the edges. She could smell the beeswax and the cold ash, and, underneath it tonight, the faint, clean bite of frost coming off his coat where he had hung it. 11 minutes. The ash waltz runs 11 and a half. There is no shortening it, and there is no sitting down. He turned back a cuff. And it is danced in the closed hold, which I imagine you would like to have some warning of. Something turned over slowly in her stomach. Fine, she said. It was not fine. The first evening, he would not touch her at all. He stood a yard away and walked her through the figure with his hands behind his back, calling the count. And she moved through empty air like a woman miming an argument with a ghost. And by the 40th repetition, she wanted to throw something. You have to. I know what I have to do. Then do it. Not until you can hold the frame alone, he said. If I take you now, you'll rely on my arm to tell you where the beat is. And in that room, you will be looking at 300 people, and my arm will not be enough. Again, from the turn. The second evening, he took her right hand and nothing else, and they went through the outside turns with a foot of freezing air between them, and it was worse than not touching, immeasurably worse, because now she had a point of contact to be aware of, and nothing to do with the awareness. The third evening, he put his hand on her back. It was low, lower than she expected, at the base of the shoulder blade where the gown would be, and it was flat and firm and completely impersonal, and she went rigid from the neck down. Breathe out, he said. I am breathing. You're holding it in the top of your chest. It makes your shoulders rise and it makes you look frightened, and they will read it as guilt. A pause. Out. She let it out. His hand moved a half-inch with her ribs, and she felt every millimetre of it. Now again. And Granger, the count began. Stop counting under your breath. I can feel your jaw doing it. They did it 11 times a night for 3 weeks. She learned that the ash waltz was not a waltz at all, but something older and stranger wearing a waltz's clothes. 3 beats, and then a held fourth, a small suspended nothing at the top of every phrase, where the whole figure hung motionless before it fell forward into the turn. The hesitation was the entire dance. Anyone could do the steps. The hesitation had to be shared exactly by 2 people who were not permitted to look at each other's feet. The first time they found it together, she nearly stopped dead. It happened in the 8th bar. She was thinking about something else, about the ditch survey, about Rosier's wet eyes. And her body did the hold without her permission, and his body did it at precisely the same instant. And for one suspended fraction of a second, there was no distance anywhere between them at all. Not physical, the physical distance was unchanged, but something in the air of the room drew tight and hummed like a wire in wind. Then the beat fell, and the turn took them, and it was gone. Neither of them mentioned it. He said, "Again," and his voice had gone slightly wrong at the edges, and she said nothing at all, and they did it again, and it happened again, and by the end of that evening, it was happening every time, and neither of them had acknowledged that it was happening once. She began to dread Tuesdays and Thursdays. She began to have difficulty with Wednesdays and Fridays, which were worse, because on those days there was nothing to do but remember. "You'll want to know about the room," he said on the last night before. They had stopped. The fire was out. He was at the window with his back to her, which she had come to understand was not avoidance, but a kind of retreat under fire. "Tell me." "Ravensmere is a shell. It was burned in 1811 and never rebuilt. No roof over the great hall, only the walls and the sky. And they hold the midwinter there because the old families like to be reminded that they endure and their houses do not." He said it flatly. "It will be enchanted against the weather, but the enchantment is deliberately imperfect. You will be able to see your own breath. There will be snow coming down inside the hall and stopping about 8 feet above the floor and going out like sparks. It is meant to be beautiful, and it is. And 300 people. 311 if the Continentals come. They stand around the walls in silence, and they do not applaud. When the music ends, they will stand for a count of 3, and then they will begin to talk. And if the talk begins before the count of 3, it means the assembly has decided against you." He paused. "Don't listen for it. If you listen for it, you'll dance the last 4 bars like a woman waiting to be shot." She looked at the long grey stretch of flagstone between them. "Malfoy." Why won't you sit down?" The silence went on long enough that she thought he might not have heard. "Not in that chair," he said. He did not explain, and she did not ask again, and something about the flat finality of it stayed with her the whole way home and half the night after. Ravensmere at 9 o'clock was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and she hated it for that. He had told the truth about the snow. It came down out of a black open sky through the ruined arches, fine as sifted flour, and struck an invisible ceiling 8 feet up and went out, each flake flaring for an instant into a point of white light, and then dying, so that the whole hall was roofed in a slow, constant rain of small extinguishings. The walls held 400 candles in iron cressets. The floor was grey stone gone smooth as bone, and around the edges of it, motionless, stood the old blood of Britain in the fashions of a century that had never quite ended, and every one of them was watching her, and not one of them was looking at her. She could see her breath. He had told the truth about that too. Ambrosia Selwyn stood at the head of the hall in grey silk with her pearls the colour of teeth. And when the hour struck, she said into the enormous quiet, "The convener's measure." And Draco Malfoy walked out of the crowd. He had done something to himself. That was Hermione's first, ungovernable, entirely useless thought, that the man crossing the stone towards her was wearing the same face he always wore and had somehow made it into a weapon. Black, severe, no ornament but the silver ring. He stopped an arm's length away and inclined his head 1 inch, which was the inclination for a widow of the first degree. which was not the inclination for her, and she understood a half-second later that he had done it deliberately and in public, and that every person in that hall had just been shown exactly what the rememberer thought her rank was. Somebody's fan snapped shut. He offered his hand. She put hers into it, and the cold of his fingers went straight up her arm, and the music began. 3 beats, and the held fourth. The first 4 bars she did not feel her own feet. She was aware only of pressure. 300 faces on the left side of her body, the flat warmth of his palm at the base of her shoulder blade, the drag of silk over stone, the tiny sting of snow going out somewhere above her hair. Her mind was running the count, and the count was slipping. "Look at me," he said, so quietly that the words were more breath than sound. They'll think it's the dance. Look at me, Granger, or you'll drop the hold in the turn." She looked up. It was a mistake, and she knew it while she was making it. His eyes were the pale grey of the sky over the ruin, and there was nothing courteous in them at all. None of the smooth arrangement he wore in company, none of the shutter. He had not put it up. For whatever reason, on that floor, with the whole assembly watching, he had not put it up, and she was looking directly at the thing underneath, and the thing underneath was looking back. The 8th bar came, and they found the hesitation together. After that, she stopped counting. It was 11.5 minutes. She measured them afterwards 100 times, and could never make them come out as anything but 40 seconds or an hour. The turns took them down the hall and back. The snow went out above them in its slow, constant dying. His hand at her back moved when she breathed, and she found that she was breathing to be moved. Somewhere around the middle, she stopped being able to tell whether the hesitation was something they were performing or something that was happening to them, that suspended nothing at the top of every phrase, that held 4th beat where the whole world stopped and waited and did not fall. And she thought with a clarity that terrified her, this is what it is like. This is what it is like to want something. His jaw was set. There was a muscle going at the hinge of it, and it did not stop for 11 minutes. Once, in a close turn, her cheek came within an inch of his, and she felt the warmth come off his skin, and she heard him breathe in sharply through the nose. And he corrected it in the next beat, and the correction was itself the loudest thing that had happened all evening. The music began to end. She felt it before she heard it, the way you feel a train slowing. The last phrase, the last 3 beats, and then the final held forth, the great suspended nothing, and the 2 of them stopped in the center of that ruined hall with the snow dying above them, and 300 people standing round the walls in absolute silence. The music stopped. They did not step apart. His hand stayed at her back. Her hand stayed in his. Her face was tilted up, and his was tilted down, and neither of them moved a fraction of an inch. And the count that the whole assembly was keeping went on somewhere outside the 2 of them. 1, 2. Draco let go of her and stepped back and bowed, and the hall began to talk. The second ordeal was called the accounting, and its terms arrived in February on a single sheet of vellum so thin she could see her own fingers through it. The claimant shall stand before the assembly and give the descent of her line entire, every generation, every seat, every quartering, and the cause of every lapse. She shall answer upon any point put to her by any confirmed member. She shall speak without book. 400 years, Hermione said. 409. Draco was at the shelf ladder with his back to her. And it isn't the 400 that will finish you. It's the last question. They always ask it, and it's always the same one. And there is no version of it that a claimant survives by improvising. Which is? He came down 2 rungs and stopped. Why were you struck out? The fire made its small sound. They'll want a cause, he said. Not a story, a cause. Bankruptcy, treason, a marriage outside the compacts, a lapse of issue. Something on the record with a date and a hand to it. If you cannot give it, Selwyn will say what she has been waiting since November to say, which is that a house struck from the roll for a cause nobody can name was struck for a cause too vile to write down. Hermione looked at the 9,000 volumes and felt, for the first time since the archive, something close to vertigo. Then we find it. Yes, he said. And something in the way he said it did not quite fit the shape of the word. They worked through February and into March. The hours changed. Tuesdays and Thursdays became Tuesdays, Thursdays and Sundays. And then Sundays became all of Sunday. And by the middle of the month, she was arriving at the library at 10 in the morning, with her own sandwiches wrapped in paper like a labourer, and staying until the lamps burned down. The long table came out from the shelves. The rolled rug stayed rolled, and neither of them ever mentioned why. They developed a working silence. That was the thing she could not have predicted. She had expected the friction to sharpen with proximity, and instead it went somewhere else entirely. Became a kind of shared weather, a low, steady atmospheric pressure that neither of them commented on, and both of them lived inside. He would put a volume down at her elbow without a word, and she would know from the angle at which he had set it whether he thought it mattered. She would push a page across, and he would read the line she was pointing at without needing to be told which line. Once she asked him for the second ombersley, and he handed it to her before she had finished the sentence, and they both went still for a moment, and then went on reading. He learned to leave the tea alone until she reached for it. She learned that when he stopped pacing, he had found something, and he still did not sit in the chair. She found Isolde on the 11th of March at 2:10 in the morning. It came out of a bundle of assize papers that had no business containing it. A fragment of a chancery brief, folded into eighths, used as packing for something else 300 years ago and forgotten. 6 lines of court-hand so cramped she had to hold it under the lamp at an angle. She read it twice before her chest understood. Item that Isolde Granger, convener, did on the Feast of the Annunciation cause the doors of the house to be opened, and did admit thereto 9 persons not of the roll, and did purpose to alter the concordance so that entry thereto should be by desert and not by descent. Hermione's hand had gone flat on the table, and being thrice warned did persist, and being fourthly warned did answer that the house was not the property of them that held it. She read it a 3rd time. Somewhere behind her the fire settled. Item that for the preservation of the assembly, the said Isolde and all her line be struck from the roll and from every register of this realm, her name to be burned out of the concordance, and it to be as though she had not been. Under it, a marginal hand. Later, drier, done. April 4th, 1698. She sat back. She was aware, in a distant clinical way, that she had begun to cry, and that she had no interest whatsoever in stopping. 328 years. A woman she had never heard of had stood in that same house in front of those same names and said the house was not the property of them that held it, and they had unmade her for it. Not killed her, not tried her, unmade her, taken her out of the world's memory like a stitch pulled from cloth. And her descendants had gone out into the dark, not knowing what they were, and had married and had children. And 4 centuries later, one of them had been called a slur in a corridor by a boy who had no idea he was addressing the senior line of the house his family had helped to burn. She sat with that for a long time. Then she said, without turning round, "How long have you known?" The pacing had stopped some minutes ago. She had not registered it. "Granger, how long?" The silence had a grain to it. "Since the first night," Draco said. She did not stand up at once. That surprised her afterwards, that the thing rising in her did not go up but down, into her hands, which she pressed flat against the table until the wood stopped moving. "You've sat there," she said, "for 4 months. I've stood there for 4 months. Don't." She got up. "Don't be precise at me. You knew what she did. You knew why they burned her. You have watched me read 1,100 pages, hunting for a bankruptcy that was never there, and you said nothing, and you let me. I said nothing that was not mine to say. That is not an answer. It's a clause. It's the binding." His voice came up for the first time in 4 months, and the hall took it badly, throwing it back off the stone. "Ad instruendam, non ad favendam. I may not withhold what is yours by right. I did not withhold it. You have had every roll, every calendar, every unindexed bundle in this building, and I put the assize papers on that table myself on the 2nd of March, because I knew what was in them, and I could not tell you, and I could put them where your hand would fall." She stopped. Outside, the weather that had been building all evening arrived at last against the west window. Not a gust, but a wall of it, rain going over the glass in a single unbroken sheet, and behind it a low shudder of thunder that came up through the flagstones and into the soles of her feet. You could have said one word. "No," he said, "I couldn't." "Why?" And he turned round, and there it was. The shutter, not up, not down, caught somewhere in between, and beneath it a face she had only seen once before, in a corridor at Thornbury with a glove in his hand. "Because if I had put it in your mouth," he said, "Selwyn would have it out of you in one question. Who told you?" And the answer would be the rememberer, and the rememberer favoured the claimant, and the binding voids, and the instruction voids, and everything you have built since November goes into the fire with it. You have to have found her. You have to be able to stand in that room and say I found her, and mean it, and have it be true. His jaw worked. "So I put the papers where your hand would fall, and I have waited 9 days for you to open the bundle, and I have not slept particularly well." The rain came harder. The lamp guttered, and the shadows swung across 9,000 spines. Hermione put a hand to the back of the chair, not to sit, to hold. "There's more," she said. "Isn't there?" He didn't answer. "There's a hand on the writ. Somebody moved it. Somebody stood up in that house on the 4th of April and said, 'Strike her out,' and you know whose hand it was, and you have known since the first night, and that is why you will not sit in that chair. The chair has nothing to do with it. Then sit in it." He looked at her. The rain went over the glass. He crossed the floor, and he took hold of the back of the chair with both hands, and he did not sit down. He stood there, with his knuckles going white on the wood, and his head bent, and for a long moment the only sounds in the hall were the water and the fire. "His name was Lucan," he said. "Lucan Malfoy. He was 41, and he had a bad chest, and he owed the Selwyns more money than the estate could carry." He said it in the flat voice of a man reading a bill of lading. He moved the writ. He read it out. He put his seal to it. And when it was done, they wrote off the debt, and the Wexcombe field went to the Rosiers as a fine, and the Malfoys kept the Rememberer's office for the next 9 generations, because we had proved we would say the thing that needed saying. His hands did not loosen. I read it when I was 11. My father gave it me to read. He thought it was a good story. Thunder went over the roof and out east. Hermione found that she had come round the table without deciding to. She was 3 feet from him. She could see the waterlight from the window moving on the side of his face. "Say the rest of it," she said quietly. "There is no rest of it." "There is, and you have been holding it in your teeth since November, and I am the only person alive you can say it to." Her voice was not steady. "Say it." He lifted his head. "I called you that word," he said. "In a corridor when I was 12. I had been taught it at that table by the man who taught me to read that writ, and I said it to the senior line of a house my family burned for wanting to let people like you in." His eyes were terrible. "And you want me to make a speech about it. You want the apology with the shape on it, the one that ends with me being forgiven and going home lighter. I'm not going to give you that. I've nothing to say that isn't obscene." "I didn't ask for a speech." "Then what?" "I asked you to say it," she said. "You've said it. That's all." And the rain came down, and neither of them moved. She was aware of every one of the 3 feet between them, and then she was aware that there were 2, and she could not have said which of them had spent the 3rd. The fire had gone low. The air in the hall had drawn tight, the way it does before the hex leaves the wand, that thin metallic charge that puts the taste of a coin on the tongue. Something had come loose in her face. She could feel it, the wet on her cheek that had been there since the assize papers, and that she had entirely forgotten about. Draco raised his hand. He did it slowly. He did it the way a man reaches towards something that might go up, and his fingers stopped an inch from her jaw and hung there, and she did not move, and he came the last inch and touched her. The backs of 2 fingers along the cheekbone, taking the water away. The cold of the silver ring came against her skin a half-second after the warmth of him did, and the 2 sensations arriving separately undid her more thoroughly than either could have alone. Her breath went out. His hand opened and lay against her face, the whole palm, and she turned into it before she knew she was going to, and heard him make a sound in the back of his throat that was not a word. He bent his head. She felt the warmth of his mouth before she felt anything else, near, not touching, a hair's breadth, the same suspended nothing as the held fourth beat of the ash waltz. The whole world stopped at the top of the phrase and waiting to fall forward into the turn. "Granger," he said against her mouth. And the great bell over the muniment room struck 3, and the sound went through the hall like a hand pulled across a table, and Draco Malfoy took his palm from her face and stepped back and turned to the window and stood with his shoulders rigid and his back to her and said, "There's a writ number on that fragment. Find the enrollment. It'll be in the Chancery series, and it will have the vote, and the vote will tell you who else moved with him." Hermione stood in the middle of the floor with her hand pressed to the place where his had been, and understood that she had just been given something, and refused something in the same breath, and that she could not, for the life of her, have said which one had happened first. For 9 days, the library had a new weather in it. Nothing was said. That was the whole architecture of it. Nothing was said, and everything was arranged around the not saying, the way a room is arranged around a piano nobody plays. He was exactly as exact as he had ever been. He corrected her Latin and her inclinations and her reading of the Chancery hand, and he put volumes at her elbow at the angle that meant this matters, and he did not once refer to the storm or the chair or the inch of air his mouth had stopped in. But he had begun to stand nearer. She noticed it on the 4th day, and then could not stop noticing. Where he had spent the winter at the window with his back to her, he now worked at the far end of the same table, and by the 6th day he was at the near end, and on the 9th she reached for the ink and found his hand already lifting it towards her, and the small dry rasp of his fingers coming off the glass was the loudest sound in the building. She did not sleep well either. She had stopped pretending to herself that she did. The enrollment came up on the 10th day. The Chancery series, the writ number, the vote. 16 names had moved with Lucan Malfoy on the 4th of April, 1698, and 9 of them were still hanging in oils on staircases she had walked up that winter. She copied the list twice and sat looking at it until her eyes ached, and thought, with a kind of appalled tenderness that she would examine later and be ashamed of, "He has been carrying this alone since he was 11 years old." The letter came the following morning. Not black paper, not the copper plate. This one was written by hand, and the hand was old and beautiful and slightly tremulous, and it invited her to take tea at Selwyn's own house in Kensington at 4 o'clock, and it said, in the last line, "I think it is time you were told what you're standing in." The house was warm and low-ceilinged and smelled of dried orange peel. There were photographs on the piano. That was the detail that unsettled Hermione most, that Ambrosia Selwyn had photographs of children on a piano in silver frames, like anybody's grandmother. "Milk? Thank you, no. Very wise. It masks a great deal." Selwyn poured. Her hands were spotted and steady. "You've found Iseult." Hermione's cup did not move. "You needn't do the face," said Selwyn. "I've known for a fortnight. Half the assize bundles in that building were catalogued by my mother-in-law, and she left marginal notes in a hand I could read at 6. Drink your tea, my dear. It's Assam, and it doesn't improve." The clock on the mantel had a sound like a small dropped stone. "I'm going to be candid with you," Selwyn said, "which I recognize you will not believe, so I shall be candid with objects instead of words. She reached beside her chair and lifted a flat case onto the table and opened it and turned it round. The vellum inside was the colour of weak tea, and it had been folded once, long ago, and the fold had been flattened out by somebody who cared about it. The court hand was the same cramped script Hermione had read at 2:10 in the morning, with her chest going strange. But this was not a copy or a brief or a fragment used as packing. This was the writ. That the said Iseult and all her line be struck from the roll and from every register of this realm, her name to be burned out of the concordance, and it to be as though she had not been. And at the foot of it, in green wax gone dark as bottle glass, one seal, unbroken, pressed clean across its whole face by a hand that had known how to hold a signet. She did not need to be told whose. She had spent 5 months learning to read exactly that. He was a small man with a bad chest, Selwyn said, quite gently. Lucan. My family owned 9,000 galleons of him. I don't say that to excuse us. I say it because you have been taught by his descendant for 5 months, and I want you to understand that I am not showing you this to shock you. You knew it already. He told you. Hermione's throat had gone dry. He told me. Of course he did. He's not a liar. That was never the Malfoy failing. Selwyn set down her cup. The Malfoy failing is that they are extremely good at telling you the true thing that stops you asking the next question. She reached beside her chair again. The second document was ministry paper. Hermione knew the weight of it in her fingers before she had read a word. The grey-blue stock, the departmental watermark, the little printed box in the top right for the file reference, and something cold began at the base of her spine and went up. Application for restriction of access. Sealed archive, Tier 2, Series, Granger and all annexed bundles, calendars and enrollments. Ground, hereditary privilege of the Office of the Rememberer, Assembly of the Concordance. Duration requested, perpetual. And at the bottom, in a fast, spare, forward-leaning hand that gave the impression of a man who wrote a great deal and disliked doing it. D.L. Malfoy. The date was the 9th of November, 2 days after the ink came up out of the char, 12 days before he had walked through the double doors at the Assembly House with rain on his shoulders and looked as though somebody had struck him under the heart. The clock made its sound. He was refused, obviously, said Selwyn. The concordance had already spoken, and the ministry can't seal what the book has opened. But I thought you might like to know that within 48 hours of your hand touching that page, the man who has spent the winter teaching you where the latch is went to your own department and asked, in writing, for the door to be bricked up forever. Hermione heard herself say, from somewhere a long way off, "That isn't proof of anything." "No," Selwyn agreed. "It's a piece of paper with a date on it. You'll make of it exactly what you're going to make of it, and I have no power over that, and I would not insult you by trying." She folded her hands. "But I'll tell you what I would ask, in your place. I'd ask what a man wants with a door bricked up when he has been so very helpful about the latch. And I'd ask how a woman finds an assize bundle that nobody has opened in 3 centuries, in a building of 9,000 volumes in 9 days." Hermione did not move. "Ah," said Ambrosia Selwyn, and there was no triumph in it at all, which was infinitely worse. He put it under your hand. She apparated to the library at 6:30, an hour early, and the wrongness of arriving early was so total that she stood on the path in the wet grey light for a full minute before she could make herself go in. He was at the long table with 3 volumes open and his cuffs turned back, and he looked up and something moved across his face that in any other week she would have called gladness. "You're early. Have you got the 16 names? Because if Bulstrode's on it, there's a—" "I've had tea with Ambrosia Selwyn." He went very still. "She has the writ," Hermione said. "The original. Green wax, unbroken, and the seal is clean across the whole face. And I know that seal because you taught me how it's done in 9 tries at that table." "Granger. And she has this." She put the grey-blue paper down on the wood between them. He looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds. He did not pick it up. He did not lean in to read it, because he did not need to, and she watched him not need to, and felt the floor go. "Say it isn't yours." "It's mine." The lamp hissed. "The 9th of November," she said. Her voice came out level, and it cost her everything she had. 2 days after the book wrote my name. Perpetual restriction. On my family. Yes. You went to my department. I went to a clerk on the 4th floor called Pomfrey Wicker, who owes my mother a favour, and I filed under the rememberer's privilege, and I was refused in 11 days. He said it flatly, the way he had said his name was Lucan, and she understood that he had rehearsed this and hated the rehearsal. All of that is true. All of it is on the file. You could have had it from the file at any time. I didn't know to look. No, he said, you didn't. She put both hands on the table because the alternative was doing something with them. 5 months, she said. 5 months of the binding says, and what is yours by right, and standing at that window like a man being flayed for it. And you had already tried to bury the entire series before you ever walked into that room and looked at me like... She stopped. Like what? He said quietly. Don't. You were going to finish it. I was going to say a great many things, and I have decided to say one. She straightened. The paper lay between them, grey-blue, ordinary, unbearable. You put the assize bundle under my hand. He didn't answer. You told me you did. 10 days ago, in this room, in the rain, and you were so pleased with the neatness of it. You couldn't tell me, so you moved the page. You have been moving pages since November, and I have spent 5 months believing that the reason I could not see the shape of this was that the shape was hidden, and it has never once occurred to me until 4 o'clock this afternoon that the reason I cannot see the shape is that I am inside a hand. That is not what this is. Then tell me what it is. I can't. You can. I cannot. His knuckles were white on the edge of the table, and his voice had gone down rather than up, which she had learned in 5 months was the worse of the two. If I say the thing you are asking me to say, and you carry it into that hall, and Selwyn puts one question to you, 1. Granger, she'll do it in 9 words. Then the binding voids and the instruction voids, and every hour since November goes into the fire, and you will stand in front of 300 people with 4 centuries in your mouth, and no standing to speak them. She has already shown you the writ. She showed you the writ so that you would come here and ask me exactly this. That is what the tea was for. Then let it void. Her eyes were burning and she despised it. Let the whole rotten office void. I don't want to be taught by a man who is... She heard the sentence coming and could not stop it in time. Who is managing me? She finished. The fire cracked. 9,000 spines stood in the dark. There is one question, Hermione said, and I am going to ask it, and then I am going to stand here for as long as it takes, and you may have all of it. He waited. On the 9th of November, she said, when you asked them to brick it up forever, did you want me to have this? And she stood there. The clock in the muniment room could be heard through 2 walls. Rain that had not yet arrived pressed against the glass as weight rather than sound. He looked at her, and for one moment the shutter was not there at all, and behind it was something so raw and so wrecked that she nearly went to him. His mouth opened. He turned his face away and he closed it, and he said nothing. She waited. She waited past the point of dignity, past the clock, past the moment when the lamp guttered and stood up again, and she gave him every second of that silence, and he did not put one word into it. Right, she said. She picked up the grey-blue paper and folded it once, and left it where it had lain, and walked the length of the hall past the rolled rug and the chair with the worn cushion. And at the door she did not turn round, and behind her she heard him say her name exactly once, in a voice she had never heard him use, and she went out into the rain that had finally started, and let the door swing shut on it. She did not go back for 19 days. The first 3 were almost bearable, because the first 3 were rage, and rage has a use. It will carry the washing up and the correspondence, and 200 pages of chancery abstracts if you let it. She worked at her own kitchen table with the assize copies spread over the oilcloth and a cold cup at her elbow, and every time her mind turned towards a grey stone hall 1/4 of a mile across a park, she took it by the shoulders and pointed it at 1698. On the 4th day, the rage went out, and what was underneath it was worse. It was not grief. She was very firm with herself about that. It was the specific, undignified sensation of reaching for something that had been at her elbow all winter and finding air. The volume set down at the angle that meant this matters. The ink lifted towards her before she had asked. The low, steady weather of another mind working 4 feet away in the same silence. She had not known how much of the work had been theirs until she had to do it alone. And the discovery arrived every hour on the hour, like a bell she could not stop. She learned the descent by rote. 409 years, 19 generations. Every seat, every quartering, every lapse, spoken aloud to an empty room until her voice cracked and she started again. She built a chain of it in her head, link by link, and when she could not sleep, she walked the chain from Wexcombe forward and made herself say the dates without looking. And somewhere around 1580, most nights she would find that she had stopped and that she was listening for a correction that was not coming, and that the silence in her flat was a different substance entirely from the silence in that library. He is a Malfoy who lied to you by arrangement, she told herself, at 2 in the morning on the 11th day. He is a man who tried to bury your family before he ever taught you to hold a seal. He stood at a window with his back to you for 4 months, said something else in the same voice because he could not trust his own face. She got up and made tea she did not drink. She had it by the 17th day. That was the thing she would remember afterwards with a kind of horror. That she had it, that the work was done, that 19 generations sat in her memory as clean and ordered as a set of drawers. What she did not have was the last question. She had the cause now. Iseult, the doors, the 9 persons not of the roll, the house was not the property of them that held it. She had the writ number and the enrollment and the 16 names. And every time she rehearsed the answer aloud in her kitchen, it came out as an accusation, and she could hear precisely what Ambrosia Selwyn would do with it. So the claimant's ground is that we are wicked. How affecting. And the point of law? She needed the point of law. She did not know where it was. And there was exactly one person alive who did. On the 18th day, she got as far as the gate of the park and stood in the wet grass with her hand on the iron for 11 minutes, and then she went home. The letter came on the 19th, and it was not from him. It was from the Assembly's clerk, and it was a printed circular of the kind that goes out to 60 people at once, and she read it standing in her hall with her coat half off. Notice is given that the office of Rememberer, hereditary in the House of Malfoy since 1417, has been resigned by the incumbent, Draco Lucius Malfoy, by instrument dated the 22nd instant. Notice is further given that, the office being resigned and not devised, the House of Malfoy is thereby struck from the roll of the concordance, with all privileges, precedencies, and appurtenances thereto, and the vaults sealed against it. Notice is further given that the said Draco Malfoy has petitioned to be heard at the accounting as a witness upon the descent of the claimant Granger, no longer being an officer bound to instruct, and the Assembly has been pleased to allow it. Hermione read it 4 times. Then she sat down on the floor of her own hallway, with her coat still on one arm, and put the paper against her mouth, and made a sound she was very glad nobody heard. The house is not property. He had struck himself out. He had done to his own name exactly what his ancestor had done to hers, with the same instrument in the same book. And he had done it not to be forgiven, because he had not written to her, because there was no letter, because 19 days had passed, and he had not sent one word. He had done it so that he could stand up in that hall and speak. A bound officer may only instruct. A witness may say anything he likes. She was on her feet before the thought finished. The library was dark. She stood in the wet grass at 2:10 in the morning and looked at the one window that had been lit every night of the winter, and there was nothing in it, and something in her chest dropped so hard she put her hand out to the gate. The manor was dark too. But behind it, past the yew hedge, past the walled garden gone to seed, there was a low building she had never entered, the muniment room, where the great bell hung that had struck 3 through 2 walls on the night of the storm. And under its slate roof, one window showed the moving orange of a fire that had been let go too long without tending. The door was not locked. It had not been locked, she thought, in 300 years, because nobody who was not a Malfoy had ever been able to reach it. Inside, the ceiling had come down. That was the first thing. A great ragged hole in the plaster where a beam had let go at some point in the last century, and above it, the sky, and the March rain coming through in a thin, cold thread that fell 20 feet and struck a stone flag with a sound like a clock. Iron presses lined the walls, every one of them standing open, every one of them empty. 600 years of deeds and enrollments and marriage compacts had been taken out and stacked on the flags in towers 3 feet high, and among the towers, on the floor, with his back against a press, and one knee up, and a bottle standing untouched an arm's length away, sat Draco Malfoy. He had not shaved. His shirt was open at the collar and grey with dust to the elbow. He was holding a single sheet of vellum with a green seal on it, and he was not reading it. And from the way his hand lay, she thought he had not been reading it for some hours. He looked up. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. The rain fell 20 feet and struck the flag. "You'll want the point of law," he said. His voice had gone to pieces somewhere. "It's Ombersley, not 1711. The other one, 1698, 3 weeks after. The Assembly held that a house struck by writ is struck for the cause stated in the writ, and for no other cause, and that the cause stated is thereafter the property of the struck house, not of the Assembly. It's the only reason Selwyn hasn't been able to invent one for you. She has to use Isolt's, and Isolt's is—" Draco. He stopped. She had never once used it. 5 months of Malfoy, and the sound of the other thing in that room did something to the air that she felt on her forearms. She crossed the flags. She came to the Tower of Deeds nearest him and stood over him, and he did not get up. And she understood, with the small, clear shock of a stone turning over in a stream, that he could not. "You resigned the office," she said. "It was mine to resign. They've struck your name out of the book." "Yes." "Your mother's vaults. Sealed on Tuesday." He turned the vellum over in his fingers. "She's known since Sunday." "She was—" Something went across his face that was almost a smile and did not manage it. "She was rather magnificent about it, actually. She said she'd been waiting 9 generations for somebody to have the manners." The rain struck the flag. Twice. 3 times. "Why didn't you write to me?" "And say what?" He looked up. "I have burned the name so that you'll come back. It would have been true, and it would have been a debt, and you'd have paid it, because you are the sort of person who pays. I wasn't going to hand you an obligation dressed up as a gift. I have had quite enough of my family doing that." "So, you were simply going to stand up at the accounting in front of 300 people and say the thing I couldn't say in November?" "Yes." Hermione's hands had begun to shake, and she let them. "Then say it now. Granger, you are not an officer of the Assembly. You are not bound to instruct. There is no binding, there is no clause, there is no ad instruendum. There is nothing left in the world that stops you." She heard her own voice climb and did not care. "I asked you a question in that library, and I gave you the whole silence to answer it in, and you took it and gave me nothing, and I have had 19 days of it, and I want the answer. On the 9th of November, when you asked them to brick it up forever, did you want me to have this?" The fire in the grate had burned down to a low copper ache. Somewhere above them, the rain went over the broken slates. Draco put the vellum down on the flags, very carefully, as though it were the last thing in the room that mattered, and both of them knew it was not. "No," he said. Her breath went out. "No, I didn't want you to have it." He got up. It took him a moment. His hand went to the press for the first foot of it. I wanted it sealed. I wanted it sealed so completely that no clerk in that department would find it in 90 years. I had it drawn on the 8th and filed on the 9th, and I lied to a woman on the 4th floor to do it. And I would like to be able to tell you it was because I knew what they'd do to you. And it was that, partly. And I told myself it was only that for about 6 hours. He was 2 feet away now, the dust on his sleeve, the pale scar under the jaw. And the rest? The rest was that the moment that name came up out of the char, I knew what I would have to do, he said. Not the teaching. That was nothing. I could have taught you with my hands in my pockets. I mean that I would have to stand in a room with you twice a week for a year and be useful to you. And that you would look at me the way you look at a problem, with your whole attention, which is a thing I had watched you do to other people since I was 12 years old, and had never once had turned on me. And I knew exactly what would happen to me. I knew it on the 9th of November in a clerk's office with the ink still wet. His jaw worked. So, I tried to have the door bricked up, not to keep you out of your inheritance, to keep myself out of the room. The rain struck the flag. And when they refused you, Hermione said, when they refused me, I put on a coat and walked through those doors and looked at you, he said, and understood that it had already happened and that I was going to have to be very careful for a year. She was crying. She had no interest at all in stopping. You weren't very careful, she said. No. His voice cracked on it. I have been catastrophically... She took hold of the front of his shirt with both hands and pulled, and he came, and the rest of the sentence was lost somewhere in the 8 inches between them. And this time there was no bell and no clause and no held 4th beat waiting to fall. He kissed her. It was not gentle, and it was not practiced, and there was nothing aristocratic about it whatsoever. His hand went into her hair and closed, and the other one flattened against her back at the base of the shoulder blade, exactly where it had learned to sit over 3 weeks of empty air and counted beats, and her whole body recognized it and answered before her mind had a vote. She heard the sound he made against her mouth, low, wrecked, half a word, and she pushed him back against the iron press hard enough to rattle 6 centuries of empty drawers, and he laughed into the kiss, once in complete disbelief, and then stopped laughing. The silver ring was cold at the nape of her neck. Above them, through the hole in the plaster, the rain fell 20 feet and went on striking the stone, and neither of them heard it any more, and neither of them let go. Dawn came into the muniment room, grey and slow through the broken slates, and found them still on the floor among the towers of deeds, her back against his chest and his coat over both of them, and neither of them had said anything useful in some hours. 19 generations, he said at last into her hair. I know them. Say the 1580s. Say them yourself. I can't, said Draco. I was never taught your house. Nobody was. That is rather the point. She turned her head and found his face closer than she had judged, and forgot the 1580s entirely for some time. They had 3 weeks. He was no longer bound to instruct, and the difference that made was not what she had expected. He argued with her. That was the whole of it. For 5 months he had corrected her, and now, with no office to lose, he argued, pushed back across the table, took Selwyn's side, and held it until Hermione's answers stopped being righteous and started being watertight, made her recite the dissent, while he interrupted with the cruelest questions he could construct, and once, memorably, reduced her to throwing an inkwell that missed him by a foot and left a stain on the flagstones that neither of them ever cleaned. He sat in the chair now. She noticed it on the first day and said nothing, and he saw her notice, and neither of them ever mentioned it. The assembly house on the last night of April was lit in every window and shuttered in every window, and the light came out in thin gold seams as it had in November, and the rain fell through them and turned briefly to gold falling. 311 stood in the chamber. They had brought in the great chairs from the long gallery and set them in a horseshoe, and at the head of it, alone, on a low dais, stood a seat of black oak so plain that the eye slid off it. No carving, no arms, a board, and 4 legs, and a back. And Hermione understood that she was looking at the convener's chair, and that its plainness was 600 years old and deliberate. She walked the floor alone. It was not 40 feet this time. It was nearer 80. She did not look down. "The claimant will give her dissent," said Ambrosia Selwyn, "entire and without book." Hermione began. She had been afraid through 19 days and 3 weeks that her voice would go. It did not. It came out level and unhurried, and she found within 4 generations that the rote had become something else in her mouth, that these were not links in a chain, but people, that Hermione Granger, who died at Wexcombe in 1544, had died of a fever in a house with a green door, that the lapse of 1611 was a boy of 9, and that saying them aloud in this room was the first time any of them had been spoken here since a small man with a bad chest had read out a writ. It took 50 minutes. Nobody moved. Then the questions came, and they came for 2 hours. Burke on the Quarterings, Avery on the Wexcombe seat, and whether the field walk showed a chapel, which was a trap about consecrated ground, and she stepped over it. A thin woman from the continental branch on the marriage of 1489. Rosier said nothing at all, and his silence sat in the horseshoe like a held breath, and Hermione knew he had 2 points of form left and was keeping them. And at last, Selwyn rose. "One question remains," she said, "and the assembly puts it. Miss Granger, why were you struck out?" The chamber went entirely still. "The assembly asks me for the cause," Hermione said. "It does." "Then the assembly has forgotten its own law." She let that sit for exactly as long as she had been taught. "Ombersley, 1698. Not the case of 1711, which everyone here can recite, but the one 3 weeks after the writ, which nobody has troubled to open in 3 centuries. A house struck by writ is struck for the cause stated in the writ, and for no other cause. And the cause stated is thereafter the property of the struck house, not of the assembly, not of its officers. Mine." Somebody's chair moved on the boards. "So I will not be asked for it," said Hermione. "I will give it." She took the copy from her sleeve, and she did not read from it, because she had known it by heart since 2:10 on the 11th of March. On the feast of the Annunciation, 1698, Iseult Granger, convener of this assembly, caused the doors of this house to be opened, and admitted 9 persons not of the roll, and purposed to alter the concordance so that entry should be by desert and not by descent. She was thrice warned. She persisted. She was warned a 4th time, and she answered. Hermione's voice did not rise, and every syllable of it reached the back wall, that the house was not the property of them that held it. She lifted her head. That is the cause. It is written in the writ in the hand of the clerk of this assembly, sealed in green wax, and it is in this room tonight, because Ambrosia Selwyn showed it to me over tea in Kensington in the 2nd week of March. She turned. I am obliged to her. I could not have proved it otherwise. Selwyn's pearls did not move, but something happened behind her face that Hermione, 5 months trained, read with perfect clarity. The small, unwilling respect of a duelist watching her own blade come back at her. The claimant states a cause, Selwyn said. The assembly requires it, proved by a witness to the instrument. The assembly has one. The assembly, said Selwyn, has a man struck from its own roll a fortnight since, who holds no office, no seat, and no standing, and whose testimony, point of form. Rosier was on his feet. He had waited 5 months for it, and his wet eyes were shining. Against the witness, he said. A struck house has no voice in this chamber. It is the whole meaning of striking. If Malfoy speaks, he speaks as a dead man, and the claimant's cause fails for want of proof. And I say so, and I spend the 2nd of my 3. The horseshoe murmured. Hermione's hands were flat at her sides. Draco stood up. He had not been seated among the members. There was no place for him among them now, but on a plain chair at the side of the room, and he came out into the floor in a coat with no ornament at all, no ring, because the Malfoy signet had gone into the sealed vault with everything else on Tuesday. Rosier's right, he said. The chamber quieted so fast it was almost a sound. A struck house has no voice. That's Ombersley too. The same 3 weeks, the same clerk, and I'd have made the point myself if he hadn't got there first. He walked to the centre of the horseshoe and stopped. But there is one thing a struck man may still do in this chamber, and it has stood since 1417, and no member has used it since 1698, because no member since 1698 has had cause. He may not testify, he may not vote, he may not be heard on any matter touching the roll. A pause. He may confess a writ his own house moved. Silence. Aikenhead, said Draco. The finding at the foot of the judgment, which is why nobody reads it. The assembly held that no house may profit by an act of its own hand, and afterwards decline to own it, and that the heir of the moving house may come into the chamber at any time, at his own cost, and state what was done and why. It is not testimony, it is confession, and it requires no standing, because a man does not need standing to accuse himself. He looked round the horseshoe. 9 of the 16 names were hanging in oils in that house. On the 4th of April, 1698, he said, Lucan Malfoy of this assembly moved the writ striking the house of Granger. He read it. He put his seal to it. The seal is green wax, and it is clean across its whole face. And I know the impression because I was made to study it when I was 11 years old, at a table in my father's house, as an example of how the thing is properly done. Nobody breathed. He did it because he owed the Selwyns 9,000 galleons and could not carry it. The debt was written off within the month. It is in our own ledger in the West Press, and I have brought the ledger. The Wexcombe field went to the Rosiers as the fine, and the office of Rememberer stayed with my family for the next 9 generations because we had proved we would say the thing that needed saying. His voice did not shake and did not soften. That is the whole of it. Iseult Granger was not struck for any fault. She was struck because she wanted to open the doors, and because a man with a bad chest could be bought for the price of a debt. I confess it for my house. My house no longer exists. I am content that it should not. He turned and walked back and sat down on the plain chair at the side of the room. Rosie stood in the middle of the floor with his mouth slightly open and no procedure left in the world to close it. "The confession is entered," said Ambrosia Selwyn, into the enormous quiet, "and the cause is proved, and the second ordeal is past." She paused, and for the first time all evening she looked directly at Hermione, and there was something almost like weariness in it. "There remains the third," she said, "the chair." They cleared the floor. It was done in silence, with a care that was almost devotional. The horseshoe drawn back, the candles carried away from the dais, until the black oak seat stood in its own pool of dark, and every person in that chamber turned to face it. Hermione understood, watching them, that this was the part they had been waiting for since November. The forms could be learned. The law could be argued. But the chair had been made in 1391 by hands nobody could name, and it had thrown claimants out of itself twice in 600 years. And the old blood of Britain believed, with an unexamined certainty that was the whole architecture of their lives, that what it tested was what ran in the veins. "It will know," someone said, very low behind her. "Approach," said Selwyn. Hermione crossed the boards. She was aware of her own heart, and of the cold coming off the stone, and of one man at the side of the room who had not moved. She did not look at him. If she looked at him, she would not be able to do this, and he knew it, and that was why he had not spoken her name. She turned and sat down. For 3 seconds, nothing happened at all. Then the chair took hold of her. It was not violent. That was the strangest part. There was no seizing, no heat, no light, simply a pressure that came up through the oak and into her spine and spread outward until it filled the whole cavity of her chest, and with it a sensation she had no word for and afterwards described badly as being red. Not her blood, not her name. Something older and more intimate went down into her the way a hand goes into water, unhurried, thorough, entirely without malice, and found the bottom of her and asked. There were no words, but the question arrived in her as clearly as if it had been spoken, and it was not the question 300 people in that room had spent their lives believing in. "Will you be bound?" She understood it in a rush that took the breath out of her. Not what are you, not whose are you. The oak did not care whose she was. It had never cared. It was asking whether she would consent to be held, to be answerable, to be arraigned, to be called to account by every witch and wizard in Britain, and to have no ground on which to refuse them. Will you be bound to all of them, the rolled and the unrolled, the named and the unnamed? Will you be held by people who are not your own? 600 years, she thought with an appalled clarity. 600 years of blood, of quarterings and compacts, and children contracted at 15. A whole civilization of purity built as a story told over an enchantment that had never once asked the question they thought it was asking. Every convener who had ever sat in this chair had answered yes and gone away, believing the oak had approved their dissent. It had approved their consent to be governed. And nobody had ever failed it for their blood at all. The two who had been thrown out, because when the question came, they had answered no. Isolde had known. Isolde had opened the doors because she had sat here and been asked this and understood. Hermione's eyes were streaming, and she did not lift a hand to them. Yes, she said, into the oak. Bind me. The chamber went white. It came out of the chair and out of the floor and out of the walls, a light with no source and no heat. And 311 people flinched from it as one animal. And in the middle of the room, on its stand, the concordance flew open and the pages turned themselves. And everywhere in that enormous book, the ink rose up out of the parchment and rearranged. 6 centuries of columns dissolving and reforming, and against every name that had ever held the chair, a new line wrote itself in that unhurried brown-red hand, bound and consenting. The light went out. Hermione sat in a black oak chair in a silent room, with her hands open on her knees, and knew, with the calm of someone standing on the far side of a river, that it was finished. She stood. Nobody spoke. Ambrosia Selwyn's face had gone the colour of her pearls, and Rosier had sat down on the floor, and somewhere at the back a woman was weeping without any sound at all. Hermione walked down off the dais, past the horseshoe, past the oils of 9 of the 16 names, and she crossed to the plain chair at the side of the room, where a man with no house and no ring was standing very still, with his eyes wet and his jaw locked, and his hands at his sides. She held out her hand, palm up, in front of 311 people, and Draco Malfoy, who had been taught before he could read that a Malfoy takes nothing he has not been given, looked at it for a moment, and then put his hand into hers and closed his fingers, and did not let go. The first thing she did as convenée was nothing at all, and it took her 11 days. That was Draco's counsel, delivered across the long table in the library at 2 in the morning, with a cold pot between them, and the assize copies pushed aside to make room for a map of the vaults. "They expect you to come in with fire," he said. "Half of them have already packed. If you strike in the first week, you'll be a conqueror, and a conqueror can be resisted. And there are 9 families in that room who have 3 centuries of practice at resisting conquerors, and none whatsoever at being outvoted." He turned the map. "Do nothing. Read. Let them sit in that house and wait, and by the 11th day they will be so frightened of what you might do that anything you actually do will come as a relief." "That's monstrous. That's the assembly." He looked up, and something almost like humour crossed his face. "You did ask me to teach you where the latch was." So she read. She read the vault schedules and the compacts, and the 11 hereditary writs that sat in a drawer in the muniment room like 11 loaded things. She read the ledgers of 9 families, and found in 4 of them the entries she was looking for. and on the 12th day she called the assembly. She did not sit in the chair. She stood beside it, which she had learned from a book of 1442 was the posture of a convener who intends to be answered rather than obeyed. "I am not going to dissolve you," she said. The stillness in the chamber changed quality. She felt it go from the held rigidity of people braced for a blow to something looser and far more dangerous, which was hope. "I have considered it. It would take me one motion and the chair's assent, and it would be finished by supper, and every one of you knows it." She let that sit. "I'm not going to do it, because a body dissolved is a body that meets somewhere else the following Tuesday, with the doors shut and no record kept. And I have spent 5 months learning what this assembly does when nobody is keeping the record." Nobody moved. "So, instead, I am going to open it." She read the instrument aloud herself. It was 4 pages, and she had written every word. The 11 hereditary seats on the Wizengamot were surrendered to election, the first poll to be held at Michaelmas, the franchise being every witch and wizard of age in Britain, without qualification of blood, property, or house. The vaults were unsealed, and their contents entered in a public schedule. Where a vault held property taken as fine or forfeit from a struck house, it was to be restored to that house's heirs, and where no heirs survived, it went to the Assembly's common fund. The compacts contracting minors in marriage were void from that hour, all 9 of them, with no consideration payable by any party. And the roll of the concordance was declared open, entry to be by nomination and vote of the Assembly, on the ground of desert and not of descent. She put the paper down. "Iseult Granger wrote the last clause of that in 1698, she said. "I have added the punctuation." The vote was called. It carried by 4. Afterwards, Hermione went and stood by the west window for a long time and shook where nobody could see her, and thought that 4 was a terrible margin, and also that 4 was infinite, because for 600 years the margin had been nothing at all. The 9 contracts were burned in the fireplace of the long gallery on a Thursday in May. It was not a ceremony. Hermione refused to make it one. But word had gone about somehow, and when she came in with the folder, there were perhaps 40 people standing in the gallery who had no business being there. Mothers, mostly, and 2 fathers, and a girl of 15 called Melisande Burke, who had been contracted at 11 to a man of 40 in Bruges, and who watched her own parchment go up with an expression that Hermione could not look at directly, and never afterwards forgot. Draco was at the back of the room. He did not come forward. When the last of them had curled and gone black, he was already gone, and she found him 20 minutes later at the top of the gallery stairs, with his hands on the rail and his knuckles white on the wood. "Astoria Greengrass was 7, he said, without turning. The ink was still wet when they brought her in to be shown to me. I was 9. They gave me a glass of wine to mark it, and I remember being pleased because I had never been given wine." Hermione put her hand flat between his shoulder blades and left it there. "It burned this morning," she said. "I know." His head went down. "That's why I couldn't stand at the front." Ambrosia Selwyn resigned from the Assembly in June and did not go quietly, which Hermione respected more than she expected to. "You'll ruin it," the old woman said at the door, with her pearls the colour of teeth and her coat over her arm. "Not this year, in 30. You will let in people who do not know why the forms exist, and they will keep the forms and forget the reasons. And in a century, there will be a body meeting in this house that does exactly what we did and has no idea that it is doing it, because it will have nothing to be ashamed of. Possibly. You don't argue. You may be right, said Hermione. That's why the record is public now. Somebody will be able to check. Ambrosia Selwyn looked at her for a long moment, and something in the well-kept blade of her face gave very slightly at the edge. He is not his father, she said abruptly. I want that said by somebody who knew both. Lucan was small, and Abraxas was cold, and Lucius was neither. He was merely afraid, and every one of them would have let that boy carry the writ for another 9 generations sooner than stand in a room and read it out. She put on her hat. I have disliked you since November, and I expect to continue. Good afternoon, convener. Rosier did not resign. He was expelled at Lammas by a vote of the whole assembly under a clause he had himself invoked twice, and the Wexcombe field went back into the Granger schedule 3 weeks later, ditches and all. They put Draco's name to the roll at Michaelmas. He tried to prevent it. He argued for an hour in the library, furiously, with his sleeves turned back and a pen bent double in his fist. And the argument was that a convener who nominated her own, he stopped on the word, unable to find one that was not either too small or too enormous, was handing every enemy she had a knife by the handle. Then let them take it, Hermione said. Granger, I am not nominating a Malfoy. There are no Malfoys on that roll, and there won't be. The house is struck, and it stays struck, and the vaults stay sealed. And if your mother wants her house back, she may petition like anyone else. She stood. I am nominating the only man in Britain who knows 9 centuries of a law that has no dictionary, who confessed his own family's writ in front of 300 people at the cost of everything he had, and who did it before he had the faintest idea whether I would ever speak to him again. He was silent. It carries, or it doesn't, she said, by desert and not by descent. Those are the words. If they don't mean this, they don't mean anything, and I'll have burned 9 contracts for a phrase. It carried by 11. He was admitted on the 1st of October in the plainest ceremony the Assembly had ever conducted, and when the concordance wrote his name, it wrote it in a new column, with no quartering above it, and nothing at all behind it. A first name in a first generation, the ink coming up out of the fibre, unhurried and brown-red. And Draco stood looking down at it with his hands at his sides and his jaw locked, and Hermione, watching from 6 feet away, saw him swallow twice before he could step back. The house was empty at dawn. They had stayed all night, the last of the schedules, the Michaelmas returns, the 1,000 small clerical griefs of unmaking something and leaving the useful part standing. And at some point around 4, the others had gone home, and nobody had thought to tell the 2 of them. And now the long gallery held nothing but grey light, and the smell of cold ash and beeswax, and the faint green bitterness of somebody's hellebore left too long in a bowl. Hermione stood at the west window, with her shoes off and her feet on the cold boards. The rain had stopped in the night. Outside, the sky over the gravelled drive had gone the pale rinsed silver of a morning that has not yet decided anything. and the whole enormous machinery of the day had not started, and for the length of perhaps 4 minutes, there was nothing in the world that required her. She heard him come in and did not turn. He stopped behind her. Then his arms came round her, unhurried, and his chin came down against her hair, and she leaned back into him and felt the whole of her spine let go at once, vertebra by vertebra, the way it only ever did here. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you." "I have no responsibilities. I'm a first-generation member of a disreputable club." His mouth was somewhere near her temple. "You are the convener of the wizarding aristocracy of Great Britain, and you have Michaelmas returns. I have burned the aristocracy. You've unsealed it. There's a difference, and you wrote 4 pages on it." She turned round inside his arms. He looked terrible. There was ink on the side of his hand and grey under his eyes, and he had not shaved in 2 days, and the silver ring was gone, sealed in a vault with the rest of it, and in its place, on the smallest finger of his right hand, nothing at all, a pale band of untanned skin that she found she liked immeasurably better. "Say the thing," she said. "Which thing?" "You know exactly which thing. You've been not saying it since June." Draco looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a wood pigeon started up in the yew and thought better of it. "I'm not going to ask you to marry me," he said. Hermione's eyebrows went up. "There are 9 contracts worth of ash in that fireplace," he said, "and every one of them was a piece of paper that told a girl what she was going to be. I have watched my family do that for 400 years, and I am not going to put a document between us, or a compact, or a settlement, or a single line in any book anywhere that says you are mine because it is written down." His hand came up and lay along her jaw, whole palm, the way it had in the rain in March. "I'm going to be here, that's all. I'm going to be at that table every night for as long as you want me at it. And if you stop wanting it, you may say so in the morning, and I will go. And there will be nothing to void, and nothing to prove, and no clause anybody has to argue. That's the worst proposal in recorded history. It isn't a proposal." "No," she said. Her eyes had gone hot. "It's better. Granger. And I want you at the table," she said, "for the whole of it. That's not a contract either. It's simply true. And I'd rather you heard it out loud than worked it out from where I put the ink." Something went out of his face then. Some last held thing, some final quarter turn of tension that had been in him since a clerk's office on the 9th of November. And she watched it go, and watched what came up underneath it, and it was so undefended that she had to put her hand over his heart. "Ask me the question," she said. "Which question?" "The one the chair asked me." He understood at once. He always did. It was the single most dangerous thing about him. "Will you be bound?" he said, very low. "Yes, by me, by you." Her voice cracked on it, and she let it. "Held and answerable, and called to account, and with no ground anywhere to refuse you. Yes, now do the rest of it." And Draco Malfoy, no house, no ring, no office, first name in a first generation, bent his head and kissed her in a room with the light coming grey through 6 windows. It was not the muniment room. There was no rain and no wreckage and nothing left to survive. There was only the 2 of them and a cold gallery and the whole unhurried morning, and he took his time about it in a way he had not been able to in March. His hands came into her hair and stayed. She got a fistful of his shirt and pulled him down and felt him laugh against her mouth. That same startled, disbelieving sound, and then his palm slid to the base of her shoulder blade, where it had learned to sit through 3 weeks of counted beats and empty air. And her whole body answered it before she had a vote, exactly as it had on a stone floor under a sky full of small extinguishings. 3 beats, and the held forth. The suspended nothing at the top of the phrase, where the world stops and waits. And this time it fell forward into the turn, and neither of them stepped apart, and nobody in the world was counting. Outside, the sun came up over the yew hedge and put a long gold bar across the boards of the gallery. And inside the empty house, the great book lay open on its stand with the ink dry on 19 generations and 1 new name. And the doors of that house were unlocked and would stay unlocked, and there was no one left anywhere to say who might come in.
When I started writing this story, I asked myself one question. What does it mean to belong somewhere? Hermione is told she is special. She has old blood. She had lead the club, but she does not want it. And that felt real to me. Sometimes people give you power you never asked for, and it can feel like a cage, not a gift. Draco was harder to write. He carries guilt, but I did not want him to cry and say sorry all the time. That is too easy. So I gave him silence. I gave him actions. My favorite moment is small. In a dark corridor, her hands are shaking. She cannot put on her glove, and he takes her hand and he does it for her, button by button. She and he says almost nothing, but you feel everything. While writing, I thought a lot about walls, the kind we build to keep people out, and the kind we build to keep ourselves safe. Draco tried to lock a door, not to hurt her, to hide from her. And here is a moral for me. The old magic never cared about blood. It only asked one thing. Will you let people hold you? Will you be part of something bigger than yourself? That is the whole story. Not who your family was, but who you choose to stand next to. Thank you for listening. Take care of each other.